On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the dictator of Rome stepped into the Curia of Pompey, surrounded by the men he had pardoned, promoted, and trusted. He did not know that beneath the heavy folds of their traditional woolen togas, 60 senators clutched the physical weight of forged iron daggers. The assassins believed that executing one man would instantly restore a broken political system. Instead, Caesar's bleeding corpse at the foot of his old rival's statue became the spark that burned the Roman Republic to the ground. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we dissect the mechanics of history's most famous betrayal, the assassination of Julius Caesar. To understand how the most powerful man in the Mediterranean was slaughtered in broad daylight, we must look beyond the mythology of the Ides of March. The men waiting in the Senate House were not common criminals. They were praetors, seasoned politicians, and even trusted military officers who had served under his own command. They possessed the aristocratic names, the political pedigree, and the ideological motive. But assassinating a sitting head of state required an impossibly flawless tactical execution. The Republic was already deeply fractured, its traditional balance of power paralyzed by the reality of a new autocracy. The dictator had concentrated unprecedented authority within his own hands, bypassing the Senate to govern directly. In a city operating on rumor and espionage, keeping a plot a secret among 60 politicians was a statistical anomaly. Yet, they managed to turn a sacred political space into a lethal trap, isolating the supreme commander from his loyal veterans. This is the anatomy of a conspiracy that sought to save a centuries-old government, but ultimately guaranteed its total annihilation. By the time the brutal civil wars concluded in 45 BCE, the Mediterranean world had been irrevocably altered. The Roman Republic was originally engineered as an intricate, self-correcting machine designed over 4 centuries to prevent any single magistrate from monopolizing military and political authority. Yet the system of annual elections, dual consuls, and endless senatorial debate had proven fundamentally incapable of managing an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Syrian desert. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome victorious, he did not shatter a functioning system. He simply formalized the stark reality that the traditional republic was already dead. The loyalties of the legions, rather than the speeches on the Senate floor, had become the ultimate arbiters of state power. Rather than attempting to revive a paralyzed bureaucracy, the dictator bypassed the old structures entirely. He began governing directly, issuing edicts and passing legislation without waiting for senatorial approval. In rapid succession, he accumulated a staggering array of unprecedented honors that blurred the line between mortal politician and absolute monarch. He was granted the right to sit on a gilded chair in the Senate House. He wore the purple robes of a triumphant general in everyday civilian life, and his profile was struck onto silver coins, a powerful propaganda tool previously reserved strictly for deities and deceased ancestors. For the ancient aristocratic families, this was far more than a structural shift in governance. The Senate, once the supreme strategic command of the Mediterranean, had been reduced to a mere advisory council, expected to passively endorse the supreme commander's decrees. This systemic marginalization stripped the senators of their dignitas, the vital public prestige, honor, and influence that defined a Roman patrician's entire existence. The definitive ideological breaking point arrived in February of 44 BCE. In a massive departure from constitutional precedent, Caesar was declared dictator in perpetuity. Historically, the Roman dictatorship was a temporary, desperate measure, legally limited to a 6-month term to resolve an existential military crisis. By accepting the office for life, Caesar eradicated the final comforting illusion that the Republic would eventually be restored. His policy of clemency toward his former Pompeian enemies, was intended to project stability and heal a fractured populace. In practice, it was a profound tactical miscalculation. It filled the Senate benches with proud, humiliated men who who had been spared execution only to be politically castrated. They were forced to attend sessions and watch as the political offices they and their ancestors had bled for were distributed as personal favors by their conqueror. The political machinery of Rome had completely failed. If the law could no longer bind the dictator, the traditionalists realized there was only one tool left to stop him. The realization that Caesar could not be stopped legally birthed a conspiracy that would eventually number over 60 senators. They styled themselves as the Liberators. This was not a homogeneous faction of bitter, long-standing enemies. The profound danger to the dictator emanated from the staggering diversity of the men coordinating his demise. A significant portion of the plot consisted of former Pompeian adversaries who had fought against Caesar during the recent civil war, men who had been humiliatingly pardoned and forced to endure the absolute supremacy of their conqueror. Yet, far more devastating was the quiet treason of his own trusted officers. Veterans who had marched with his legions across Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and stood beside him in the trenches were now turning against him, alienated by his shift from a frontline commander to an untouchable autocrat. The driving tactical architect of the conspiracy was the praetor Gaius Cassius Longinus, a seasoned officer known for his sharp military intellect and deep resentment of one-man rule. Cassius recognized that a successful assassination could not simply be an act of uncoordinated violence. It had to be structurally framed as a constitutional restoration. He understood the lethal mechanics of securing power, but he also recognized his own public limitations. Cassius lacked the broad, unquestioned prestige needed to legitimize the execution to the Roman populace. For the plot to survive the immediate aftermath, he required a flawless political symbol. That symbol was found in another praetor, Marcus Junius Brutus, a man deeply favored by Caesar and respected across Rome for his philosophical integrity. Brutus carried a surname that functioned as the foundational myth of the Roman state. His ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, had overthrown the last tyrannical king of Rome centuries earlier, establishing the very republic that the current dictator was systematically dismantling. Cassius pragmatically manipulated Brutus's intense sense of stoic duty, planting anonymous messages on Brutus's public tribunal, demanding that he awaken to his family's historical legacy. Brutus was recruited not for his battlefield prowess, but for the profound political shield his bloodline provided. If a Brutus held the dagger, the conspirators believed the act would be universally recognized as a sacred civic duty rather than base treason. Set against this coalition of traditionalists and disillusioned officers were the Caesarian loyalists, anchored primarily by the consul Mark Antony. Antony was a formidable battlefield commander, fiercely loyal to Caesar, and he represented the sheer, unyielding military mass that the dictator still controlled. He was the physical embodiment of the political reality the conspirators deliberately chose to ignore. Caesar's authority did not rest entirely on senatorial decrees or public popularity. It was built upon the swords of tens of thousands of hardened veterans who cared absolutely nothing for the Senate's ancestral prestige. The conspirators operated under the deeply flawed assumption that if the head of the autocracy was severed, the loyalist military apparatus would simply evaporate, allowing the traditional republic to spontaneously reset. They had the names and they had the motive. But executing the most powerful man in the Mediterranean required an impossibly flawless plan, and the window to strike was rapidly closing. The pressure on the conspirators was driven by a ticking clock. On March 18, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was scheduled to depart Rome to launch a massive military expedition against the Parthian Empire in the east, seeking to avenge the devastating Roman defeat at Carrhae. This impending departure created an unforgiving, absolute deadline. Once the supreme commander left the capital and embedded himself within the ranks of his legions, he would be shielded by tens of thousands of fiercely loyal troops. An assassination attempt in a fortified military encampment or on an active frontier was a tactical impossibility. The strike had to occur within the city walls before the dictator could ride out to war. Yet orchestrating the murder of a reigning head of state in the center of Rome presented a staggering logistical challenge. Even in civilian life, Caesar did not walk alone. He was perpetually surrounded by a dense throng of clients, political petitioners, and a retinue of lictors. Attempting an ambush in the winding, congested streets of the capital carried an unacceptable risk of failure. A public assault could easily devolve into a chaotic street brawl, allowing Caesar to slip away or be rescued by the urban plebs who widely idolized him. To guarantee a successful execution, the conspirators needed to artificially isolate him, stripping away his physical protection while keeping him entirely unaware of the danger. The tactical solution engineered by Cassius was brilliant in its irony. The conspirators decided to weaponize the most sacred political customs of the Roman Republic to destroy its conqueror. They selected the upcoming Senate session scheduled at the Curia of Pompey for their staging ground. By strict ancient Roman law, the Senate House was a consecrated space where weapons and armed military guards were absolutely forbidden. By inviting him to conduct state business there, the assassins ensured that Caesar would cross the threshold entirely unarmed, leaving his veteran bodyguards outside. The heavy folded wool of the traditional Roman toga provided the perfect concealment for forged iron daggers. They were turning the very heart of Republican governance into an inescapable kill zone. However, isolating the dictator solved only the primary objective. The assassins immediately identified a secondary, potentially fatal variable in the consul Mark Antony. As Caesar's trusted lieutenant, Antony was a highly capable battlefield commander with imposing physical strength. If he were present inside the chamber when the attack commenced, Antony possessed the combat experience to disrupt the mobbing, potentially defending Caesar long enough for loyalists to intervene. To neutralize this threat, the conspirators assigned Gaius Trebonius, a seasoned officer who had once served alongside both men, a specific vital task. Trebonius was to intercept the consul outside the entrance to the Curia, engaging him in a prolonged, distracting political conversation to keep Rome's second-in-command physically locked out of the room. The logistical framework was finalized, and the trap was firmly set for the morning of the Ides of March. But in a city buzzing with paid informants, political spies, and constant rumors, keeping a plot of this magnitude a secret among 60 politicians was a statistical impossibility. The rumors circulating through the capital had become dense enough to materialize into explicit warnings. In the weeks leading up to the departure for the Parthian campaign, the political tension in Rome was palpable, filtering down from the aristocratic villas to the crowded streets. It was in this deeply polarized environment that a trusted soothsayer named Spurina warned the dictator to beware of danger no later than the Ides of March. Modern historical analysis frames this not as supernatural clairvoyance, but as the inevitable leakage of an assassination plot that required the coordination of over 60 patricians. In a city operating on patronage and espionage, the conspiracy was essentially an open secret. The heavy hushed silence within the sprawling halls of Caesar's Domus on the Palatine Hill reflected the unspoken reality that an attack was imminent. On the morning of March 15th, 44 BCE, the carefully constructed timeline of the assassins nearly collapsed. Caesar awoke feeling physically unwell, and his wife, Calpurnia, was in a state of profound distress. The historical record indicates she had suffered vivid nightmares throughout the night, dreaming that the roof of their home had caved in and that she was holding her bleeding husband in her arms. Calpurnia was not known for political interference or superstition, making her sudden desperate panic highly uncharacteristic. Unnerved by her distress and his own declining health, the dictator made a tactical decision that threatened to unravel the entire conspiracy. He decided to remain at home and ordered Mark Antony to formally dismiss the gathered Senate. When word of the delay reached the Curia of Pompey, the conspirators were thrown into a state of quiet panic. The trap had been meticulously set. The daggers were concealed beneath their robes, and if the session was officially canceled, the plot would almost certainly be exposed before another opportunity arose. Realizing the timeline was rapidly fracturing, the assassins deployed their most vital immediate asset, Decimus Brutus. Unlike Marcus Brutus, Decimus was a highly capable military officer who had served brilliantly under Caesar in Gaul and commanded his naval forces. More importantly, he possessed the dictator's absolute trust, having dined with him just the evening before. Decimus arrived at Caesar's residence with a specific psychological objective: to weaponize the Supreme Commander's own dignity against him. He found Caesar preparing to stand down and immediately began to dismantle his caution. Decimus challenged Caesar's pride, asking how the Senate would perceive it if the man who held absolute power over the Roman world refused to conduct state business because his wife had suffered a bad dream. He argued that such an absence would be seen as a profound insult to the patricians, who had gathered specifically to grant him further honors. Decimus suggested that if Caesar truly wished to postpone the session, standard political decorum required him to at least appear in person to announce the dismissal, rather than hiding behind his lieutenants. The manipulation was flawlessly executed. The ingrained pride of a Roman aristocrat, combined with the military discipline of a commander who refused to show weakness before his political subordinates, overrode any lingering sense of self-preservation. Ignoring the pleas of his wife and the warnings of his priests, the dictator stepped into his litter and ordered his bearers to march toward the theater of Pompey. He was entering the kill zone. When the Supreme Commander's litter arrived at the theater of Pompey, the tactical isolation phase of the plot activated flawlessly. As Caesar dismounted and proceeded toward the Curia, Gaius Trebonius intercepted the consul Mark Antony near the entrance. Leveraging his past relationship with Antony, Trebonius initiated an intense, fabricated political dispute. The seasoned military commander was successfully pinned outside the chamber walls, oblivious to the fact that his supreme commander was walking into a vanguard of hostile blades. Inside the hall, the dictator advanced toward his gilded chair. The uninvolved senators rose in traditional deference. As Caesar sat, the conspirators immediately moved in, forming a dense ring around the magistrate and masking their movements from the rest of the room. The execution commenced under the guise of bureaucratic procedure. Tullius Cimber stepped forward, urgently presenting a petition for the recall of his exiled brother. Caesar, eager to begin the formal session, waved him away. But Cimber aggressively closed the distance. Grasping the fabric of Caesar's toga, Cimber forcefully yanked it down from the dictator's shoulders. This aggressive breach of physical decorum was the prearranged tactical signal. Immediately behind the chair, Publius Servilius Casca drew his concealed dagger and aimed a strike at Caesar's neck. The sharp metallic tear of iron ripping through heavy wool signaled the eruption of violence. However, Casca's strike was poorly angled, inflicting only a glancing wound. Caesar instantly reacted, seizing Casca's arm and driving his metal-writing stylus deep into the assassin's flesh. For a brief moment, the victim fought back, but the conspiracy rapidly devolved into a desperate, chaotic melee. The ensuing slaughter stripped away any illusion of a noble surgical restoration of the state. These attackers were seasoned politicians, not frontline legionaries, trained in the disciplined geometry of close-quarters combat. As over 60 men surged forward simultaneously in the confined space around the gilded chair, the tactical execution collapsed into a frantic, uncoordinated mobbing. Arms tangled in restrictive togas, blades swung wildly, blinded by panic, adrenaline, and the sheer density of the pressing crowd. Several conspirators inadvertently wounded each other in their frenzy to land a blow. Cassius reportedly slashed Brutus across the hand, while others took cuts from friendly blades in the crush of bodies. Despite his declining health, the hardened military commander fought to survive. Bleeding profusely, Caesar threw himself violently forward, attempting to break through the ring of senators and reach the open floor. But the numerical superiority was absolute. He was pushed back, struck repeatedly from all angles. The decisive psychological blow landed when he saw Marcus Brutus moving in with a drawn blade. Facing the descendant of the Republic's founder, a man he had pardoned and treated as a son, Caesar recognized the futility of resistance. There was no theatrical, prolonged monologue. Historical consensus suggests he simply accepted his fate in dignified silence, pulling the blood-soaked folds of his toga over his face to maintain his patrician dignity in death. He collapsed under the relentless assault, his body sustaining 23 distinct stab wounds. Later medical examinations by the physician Antistius would conclude that of the 23 strikes, only the second blow to the chest was independently fatal. The rest were the frantic, messy results of a panicked mob ensuring their shared complicity. In a profound, inescapable historical irony, the dictator's lifeless body came to rest at the base of the statue of Pompey the Great, bleeding out over the marble pedestal of his defeated rival. The dictator was dead.
Tyranny.
Brutus raised his bloody dagger, ready to declare the Republic restored. But as he looked up, he realized a fatal miscalculation. Brutus stood over the body, holding the bloodied dagger, and began to speak, intending to formally announce the restoration of the Republic to the Senate. But he was speaking to an empty room. The uninvolved senators, terrified by the sudden eruption of violence and fearing a wider purge, had already broken ranks and fled in blind panic. The heavy wooden doors of the Curia of Pompey were thrown open as patricians scrambled over one another to escape the massacre. The assassins had meticulously planned the mechanics of the murder, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the psychological fragility of the political body they claimed to be saving. They expected a dignified, immediate return to senatorial debate. Instead, they precipitated a catastrophic vacuum of authority. Undeterred by the immediate flight of their peers, the Liberators wrapped their togas tightly around their left arms and marched out of the theater complex. Accompanied by a vanguard of gladiators they had hired for physical protection, they moved through the winding streets of Rome toward the fortified heights of the Capitoline Hill, holding their weapons aloft and chanting that liberty had been restored. They anticipated the urban plebs would flood the streets to cheer the death of a tyrant. Instead, they were met with the harsh sound of heavy wooden shutters being slammed shut and iron locks engaging across the city. The ordinary citizens of Rome did not view the dictator as a tyrant. To them, Caesar was a champion of the people who had stabilized the food supply and pardoned their debts. The populace saw only a cabal of wealthy, disconnected aristocrats who had just assassinated the only man holding the fractured empire together. By the time the conspirators barricaded themselves inside the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, the scale of their strategic failure became starkly apparent. Cassius and Brutus possessed an impeccable tactical blueprint for eliminating the supreme commander, but they possessed absolutely no constitutional or military framework for governing Rome on the day after the assassination. They had assumed the Republic was a dormant machine that would simply restart once the autocratic wrench was removed from its gears. In reality, the traditional levers of state power had been entirely dismantled by decades of civil war. The Senate was scattered, the treasury was locked, and the city was plunging into a state of paralyzed terror, waiting for the inevitable military response. That military response rested entirely in the hands of the man they had explicitly chosen to spare. When the violence erupted inside the Curia, the consul, Mark Antony, had not rushed in to save his commander. Recognizing the overwhelming odds, he had immediately stripped off his official robes and fled into the chaotic streets disguised as a commoner. However, Antony did not surrender to panic. As the assassins sat isolated on the hill, debating constitutional theory, the seasoned general moved with ruthless, pragmatic speed. He swiftly secured Caesar's private papers, locked down the massive state treasury housed at the Temple of Ops, and began sending urgent messages to the tens of thousands of loyalist veterans currently camped outside the city walls. The assassins had barricaded themselves on the Capitoline, confident that reason would prevail. But they had left Mark Antony alive, and Antony was about to turn the streets of Rome into a weapon. Antony recognized that raw military force alone might trigger a prolonged conflict he was not yet fully prepared to manage. Instead of an immediate siege, he opted for political maneuvering, leveraging the state apparatus he now firmly controlled as the sole surviving consul. On March 17th, he convened the Senate at the heavily guarded Temple of Tellus. There, he engineered a masterful paradoxical compromise. He offered the assassins full legal amnesty, successfully averting an immediate outbreak of civil war in the capital. However, the cost of this amnesty was absolute. The Senate had to agree that all of Caesar's acts, past decrees, and future appointments would be officially ratified. This brilliant diplomatic stroke legally checkmated the conspirators. They could not officially declare Caesar a tyrant, because doing so would instantly invalidate the prestigious political offices, provincial commands, and wealth that the dictator had previously granted them. The brittle political truce held just long enough for the Caesarian faction to execute their decisive counterstroke. The ideological victory of the Liberators was completely obliterated on March 20th, the day of Caesar's public funeral. The assassins had fundamentally underestimated the deep emotional and economic bond between the supreme commander and the urban plebeians. When Antony stood before the roiling crowd in the Forum to read Caesar's final will and testament, he did not rely on abstract republican philosophy. He deployed the devastating logic of wealth and logistics. The document revealed that Caesar had left his extensive private gardens across the Tiber River to the public as a permanent park, and bequeathed a cash gift of 300 sesterces to every single Roman citizen. This single revelation shattered the Senate's narrative. To the Roman populace, the dictator was not a tyrant suppressing their freedom. He was their greatest benefactor, brutally murdered by a cabal of arrogant, disconnected aristocrats who cared only for their own monopoly on power. Sensing the shift in the crowd's momentum, Antony drove the final nail into the conspiracy. Lifting the blood-stained, dagger-torn toga of his supreme commander, he delivered a calculated funeral oration that transformed widespread grief into weaponized fury. The stifling, smoke-filled air of the crowded forum quickly grew volatile as mourning turned to violent outrage. Enraged citizens, realizing the sheer scale of the financial and political loss the Senate had inflicted upon them, tore apart the surrounding market. They seized wooden benches, merchant tables, and tribunal platforms, piling them into a massive makeshift cremation pyre right in the political heart of the Republic. As the flames consumed Caesar's body, the mob turned their wrath outward, surging through the streets to hunt down the conspirators and eventually burning the Curia of Pompey down to its foundations. Stripped of their political legitimacy and facing imminent execution at the hands of the urban mob, the architects of the conspiracy were forced to confront their catastrophic failure. The traditional republic they worshipped was a hollow illusion that existed only in the minds of the patrician class. The true power of Rome now belonged to the masses and the loyalist legions. Brutus and Cassius fled the city they claimed to have saved. But the true danger to their lives, and to the Republic itself, was a name buried deep inside Caesar's will. A name no one had anticipated. That name was Gaius Octavius. He was Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew, a relatively unknown youth studying military logistics with the legions in Apollonia. The assassins, and even the consul Mark Antony, had entirely dismissed him as a political non-entity. Yet, Caesar's final testament posthumously adopted the teenager, granting him the most dangerous and powerful weapon in the Mediterranean, the name Gaius Julius Caesar. When Octavian crossed the Adriatic and arrived in Italy to claim his inheritance, he did not come as a grieving relative. He arrived as a calculating political operative, willing to leverage his newly acquired immense wealth to buy the immediate loyalty of his adoptive father's hardened veterans. The Liberators had fundamentally misunderstood the crisis of their age. They believed that executing one man would magically heal the state. They failed to recognize that the structural conditions that created Caesar an empire too vast to be managed by a sluggish committee of squabbling aristocrats, and massive professional armies whose loyalties belonged solely to their paymasters rather than the Senate, had not changed. By assassinating the dictator, they simply removed the central stabilizing force, plunging the Roman world back into the systemic violence they had claimed to prevent. What followed was 13 years of brutal, exhausting civil war that completely dismantled the old Republican order. The senatorial forces were systematically hunted down by the combined military mass of Antony and Octavian at the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. The traditionalist dream was permanently extinguished. Facing total tactical collapse, both Cassius and Brutus committed suicide, falling on their own swords rather than submitting to the heirs of the man they had murdered. The assassins were wiped out, but the cycle of violence continued. The fragile alliance between Caesar's avengers inevitably fractured, culminating in a final war that left Octavian as the undisputed master of Rome. He would eventually be granted the title Augustus, becoming the first true emperor and establishing an imperial dynasty that would govern for centuries. This is the ultimate, tragic paradox of the Ides of March. The 60 senators waiting in the Curia of Pompey had sought to turn back the clock and restore an ancestral oligarchy. Instead, their conspiracy functioned as the precise catalyst for the total destruction of the Roman Republic. The 23 knife wounds delivered at the base of Pompey's statue did not kill autocracy. They merely baptized it in blood. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of history's most famous betrayal. If you want to continue exploring the tactical decisions, monumental blunders, and pivotal moments that shaped our world, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.